friends. So now we are starting with integrated respiratory system. This is one of the very important systems, particularly for physiology. You do get a lot of questions from here. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the beginning. After that, we are going to be talking about core respiratory medicine, wherein you have questions from COPD, from asthma. Overall approach to the lung disease is also very, very important. All right. So then let's start off with spirometry, something very, very important. So nowadays you get questions in an integrated manner, wherein they'll show you some sort of the flow volume curve, and then they can go into radiology, they can go into medicine and ask you questions from there. Okay, so how we interpret the spirometry curve? So what you are seeing as this normal breathing, so this is the normal breathing, and the volume of the air that is exchanged during normal breathing is known as the tidal volume. So this is the tidal volume, which is around 500 ml or 0.5 liters. Then when you take a deep inspiration, forceful inspiration is what you take. Deep inspiration, right? So the amount of extra air that is inhaled when I take that extra voluntary forceful inspiration is known as the inspiratory reserve volume. It's the extra volume that I'm taking in, which is 2 to 3 liters. It's pretty high. It's 2 to 3 liters. On the other hand, when I do a forceful expiration, what is the extra volume of air which I can breathe out? That is the expiratory reserve volume, and you can see schematically only that it's almost half of the IRV. So it's somewhere close to 1 liters. All right. So that's how you want to remember. I can inspire double the air, but expire only half of that volume. And the volume of air which nobody can take away from you. It is your birthright. No amount of forceful expiration can take that away. And that is the residual volume, which is again 1.1 liters. So this is what is always going to remain in the lung. So this is the residual volume. So all of these you can notice are volumes. The moment you hear capacity, it's always a sum of two things. So if they ask me what is the total amount of air at the end of a forceful inspiration, so that is going to be this plus this, isn't it? It's going to be IRV plus tidal volume. So this is known as inspiratory capacity, which is a sum of IRV plus TV. So we can do the math and we'll know the inspiratory capacity. Second, what is very, very important is what is the amount of air that is left behind after a normal expiration called. Extremely important. So this is functional residual capacity. So at the end of a normal breath, at the end of a normal expiration, the amount of air that is left in my lungs is ERV plus RV, that is functional residual capacity. Very, very important. Alright, so if they want to ask one thing, this is what you should place your bets on. Then, if they ask me after a forceful inspiration and a forceful expiration, what is the total amount of air that is involved in this entire exchange, is going to be a sum of all of these, and this is what is known as vital capacity. So vital capacity is after forceful inspiration and forceful expiration. This is the total amount of air that is going to be exchanged, and the remaining is residual volume. Again, forceful expiration, RV is not going to be taken away. And when you add vital capacity and residual volume, this makes the total lung capacity. Alright, so these are the numbers and the values that you want to remember. Now talking about the main approach to spirometry. So when they give you that there is low FEV1 by FVC. So here, this is a sign low. O for obstructive. So we are dealing with obstructive lung disease. Very important flowchart that can be asked to you in an integrated fashion. Okay. So low FEV1 by FVC is obstructive. This is because here, predominantly, it is the numerator, it's the FEV1 which is reducing. So, it's actually the numerator which is decreasing more than the denominator. On the other hand, when it is normal to high, FEV1 by FVC, because FEV1 slightly reduces, but FVC actually reduces too much, because in restrictive you have low lung volumes. So the forced vital capacity here, FVC, goes markedly down, and that is why you have a normal to high FEV1 to FVC in restrictive lung diseases. Alright, so this is how the first step is, whether FEV1 by FVC ratio is low or it's normal to high. Alright, now when it is obstructive, you want to do a bronchodilator challenge. If you see that FEV1 increases by more than 12%, the number is also important. The reversibility is what makes the diagnosis as asthma. So here the diagnosis becomes asthma. If you see that after bronchodilator there is no change, the diagnosis becomes COPD. It is non-reversible COPD. Here we take use of DLCO, diffusion of carbon monoxide. If the DLCO is reduced, that means that the barrier here, the gas barrier here is impaired. So this is what I would diagnose as emphysema. Whereas if the DLCO is normal, then it is chronic bronchitis. Okay, so this is how we are going to be approaching obstructive lung diseases. On the other hand, if it is restrictive lung disease, you look at DLCO. If the diffusion is impaired, again it's the alveolar membrane which is affected. So reduction in DLCO is going to be seen in all pulmonary fibrotic diseases. So pulmonary fibrosis or interstitial lung diseases, or if you have pulmonary edema, or there is asbestosis, sarcoidosis, any disease which is affecting the alveoli will have reduced diffusion of carbon monoxide. If DLCO is normal, very, very important. If it's a restrictive lung disease with normal DLCO, it means that the restriction is from outside. It is from the chest wall. So here you want to rule out chest wall disorders. So there could be kyphoscoliosis, there could be morbid obesity here, or you could have myasthenia gravis, so any sort of neuromuscular disorder. Alright, so this is very, very important approach to spirometry. Now let's have a look at the flow volume curve. So this is how a normal curve appears. So look at the x-axis and the y-axis in all of the graphs. Don't be scared, just look at the axis and half of the job is going to be done. So here you can see, even though it's not labeled in this, but this is where you are going to have the volumes. So if you look at this flow volume curve, this is the normal flow volume curve, and when you look at this is a very small volume. Look at the volumes, they are so much reduced, right? So this is your hack to identify restrictive lung disease. All right, so it's just gonna be a very small volume curve because the main pathology in restriction is that the lungs are smaller, right? So that's how we identify this. On the other hand, in obstruction, because there is air which is retained, right? So there is air trapping which happens because the airways are affected. You're gonna have more lung volume than normal, and what is very important is this scooping here. This scooping is the characteristic feature of obstructive lung disease. All right, so low volume, restrictive, high volume, obstructive. So this is very easy. They usually don't ask you this. They ask you these other variants, all right, of the obstructive lung disease. So this is what a normal curve looks like. Always make a note of where inspiratory and expiratory is in these graphs. When you see this scooping, this is your obstructive lung disease, like we have already discussed. When you see that both the inspiration and expiration are affected, this is what is known as a fixed airway obstruction. So examples of fixed airway obstruction could include something like laryngospasm. Yeah, so that is a fixed airway obstruction. Laryngospasm or tracheal stenosis. So these are all fixed airway obstruction. If you see that the deficit or the flattening is only in the inspiratory part of the curve. So here this is an example of a cross mnemonic again. Yeah, so here what you want to remember, when you see that the flattening is only inspiratory, this is a variable obstruction but variable extrathoracic obstruction. Yeah, so here E and I never go together. In this graph, when you see it's the expiratory curve which is flattened, the example or the diagnosis becomes variable intrathoracic obstruction, right? So this is how you remember E and I as cross mnemonic. Okay, so this is about the variable obstruction. Example of a variable extrathoracic obstruction means it is outside the lungs, so somewhere around the level of vocal cord, so vocal cord palsy. Whereas in variable intrathoracic obstruction, it is within the trachea or within the bronchi, so this could be a foreign body or maybe a tracheal tumor. Yeah, so this is your intrathoracic obstruction. So this is how we want to interpret all of these flow volume curves. This is what was asked as a repeat question. Okay, so very important. Let's compile a few formulae and study them. So what is minute ventilation? I'm sure you all know this. This is respiratory rate into tidal volume. What is alveolar ventilation? Is the amount of alveolar air which is exchanged. So for this, I need to subtract the dead space. This is going to be the tidal volume minus the volume of dead space. So what is the formula for calculating dead space? So this is how you can actually calculate that. So it's going to be tidal volume into PaCO2 minus PeCO2. So So PaCO2 is your arterial CO2, whereas E is the expired CO2. All right. So these will be given to you, and this is how you can actually calculate alveolar ventilation. Talking about the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. So here you have bound oxygen and you have dissolved oxygen. Bound oxygen, remember, is with the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin carrying capacity of oxygen into saturation is how you know what is the bound oxygen. All right. So you can measure the saturation, and oxygen carrying capacity is going to be 1.34 into the hemoglobin concentration. Right. So this is how you're going to be approaching these numericals. So 1.34 into hemoglobin concentration into the saturation is what is bound to the hemoglobin, whereas what is dissolved in the oxygen is the PaO2, the partial pressure of oxygen, into 0.0031. So you need to remember these values for both of these. What is more important is the application again. So in anemia and polycythemia, it's the hemoglobin concentration which is affected. Anytime something else is bound to the hemoglobin, such as carboxyhemoglobin, methemoglobin or methemoglobinemia, you're going to have saturation which drops. Yeah. So this is how you can approach this table here. What happens in carbon monoxide poisoning? Hemoglobin concentration is normal, but SaO2 reduces. PaO2 is normal, but the total oxygen content reduces. In anemia, hemoglobin concentration reduces, whereas other parameters are normal, but overall total reduces. In polycythemia, hemoglobin increases, so overall increase. Methemoglobinemia, again the saturation is low, so again the net is reduction. Very important is cyanide. This is what will be tested. So in cyanide, everything is normal. It is basically the electron transport chain which is blocked. Yeah, we have done in biochemistry all the ions block complex 4. So it is blocking the utilization of the oxygen, right? So you're going to have everything normal, but the patient still has anoxia, and this type of anoxia is known as histotoxic anoxia. I've taught you this in forensic, in toxicology. So this is histotoxic anoxia, wherein everything remains normal, okay, and yet the cells are hypoxic or anoxic. So this is about the physiology part. The most important thing which always gets you one question is the oxygen dissociation curve. So first of all, what is the shape of the normal oxygen dissociation curve? So it's a sigmoidal curve. Why is it a sigmoidal curve? It's because of positive cooperativity, meaning every oxygen molecule that attaches to hemoglobin is further gonna favor other oxygen molecules to bind to it. Like once one friend comes into class, it's gonna have other friends also. They're gonna call other friends. You also come and attach. So it keeps increasing the affinity of the other oxygen molecules. That is known as positive cooperativity. Okay, so this is about the sigmoidal shape. What is P50? P50 is the partial pressure of oxygen at which the saturation is 50%. Alright, so if you look at the curve, it is somewhere close to 25 to 27 mm. So you can remember 26 mm Hg. It is approximately 27 where you have 50% saturation. Alright, so we can basically talk about the shift in terms of P50 as well. That's how the question can be asked. So when do you have left shift? When everything decreases. So low temperature, low BPG, low H+, everything reduces is left shift. Very important, hemoglobin F, carbon monoxide. What happens in left shift? As the curve goes towards left, the affinity increases and the oxygen delivery reduces. So what you want to remember here is that left loves, alright. So left loves, so what happens? The affinity for oxygen increases. So when affinity is too much, will it let go? No, it will not let go. So overall delivery reduces. Overall delivery reduces means your P50 also reduces. The P50 also reduces. On the other hand, right shift means what? Your affinity has reduced. Affinity has gone down, so P50 increases, the delivery increases. All right. So what you want to remember, hemoglobin F has a higher affinity, right? That's why the blood will go to the fetus preferentially. It's going to take all the oxygen from the mother preferentially. Yeah. So this is hemoglobin F. Carbon monoxide, very important, has a leftward shift, very important, leftward and downward, because overall hemoglobin saturation is dropping. So leftward and downward shift, extremely important question. Myoglobin also has a higher affinity, leftward shift. All right. So left loves, right shift. When are you going to have increased delivery? When everything increases. So high temperature, high 2,3 dpg and high H plus. Remember, it is high H plus. So all of these are going to cause increased delivery. You also want to remember Gita as other causes of increased delivery or reduced affinity or right shift. One is growth hormone. Second is exercise. T is thyroid. A is altitude. A is also androgens. And A is anemia. So you can see that all of these causes, when hemoglobin knows that the body needs more oxygen, it's going to increase the delivery, right? So after exercise, thyroid, growth hormone, androgens, altitude, anemia, you're increasing the flow by right shift. So just logic is what you want to remember. Remember left loves, and all of this falls into place. Now, two more graphs that you want to interpret. So here the kind of questions would be identify this part. So they can give you options like FRC, FVC, FEV1, and so on and so forth. So basically, this is the point where everything is in equilibrium. What is this point? This is the point where airway pressure is at 0. So let's have a look at this. What you can see here is that chest wall has a predominantly negative pressure. You want to remember that chest wall, or basically the intrapleural pressure, is going to be negative, whereas the lungs have a tendency to collapse. So the lungs are going to have a positive pressure. So the net pressure is going to be 0. It's going to cancel each other out. And what is that point? That point is at the end of a normal expiration. At the end of one cycle of expiration, everybody is tired. So they are like, you are exerting negative, I am exerting positive, let's just call truce, and we're going to have 0 pressure. So this net pressure, which becomes 0, is at functional residual capacity. Alright, so this is what you want to remember. Then again, more or less the same thing. So here they can ask you to label inspiration and expiration. So on the x-axis, very easy if you look at the volume. So where the volume is increasing is inspiration, where the volume is decreasing is expiration. So this is the first step. Then what you look at here are these two pressures that we want to label. So what is this pressure which is always on the negative? It is the intrapleural pressure. So remember, the intrapleural pressure, or basically the chest wall pressure, remains negative throughout. So you can see how in inspiration it is more negative, whereas in expiration it is less negative. On the other hand, when we look at the alveolar pressure, it is negative during inspiration, but it is positive during expiration, and in the middle it is 0. Like we saw in the middle, this is going to be 0, whereas chest wall pressure becomes negative, right? So this is intraalveolar and intrapleural pressure, and the pressure difference is known as transpulmonary pressure. So this is how you can interpret these graphs based on these concepts. Two more graphs for you. So whenever you see V and P, whenever they ask you to label what is the green line, so delta V by delta P, not the other way around, it is VP, VIP, so V is up. Delta V by delta P is known as the compliance. Alright, so this is the compliance of the lung. Imagine a balloon. Alright, so there is going to be a higher compliance in two E's, in emphysema and elderly. So basically, if you are imagining a balloon that you are inflating, it's going to be very easy to inflate a balloon that's very flaccid, very wrinkled, like an elderly person's lung, or like an emphysematous lung. It's very easy to inflate it. So the delta V, the change in the volume of the balloon per the pressure that you're applying, it's going to be much more. Alright, so that's why in elderly and emphysema, remember 2 E's, the compliance increases. Whereas a very thick fibrous balloon, no matter how much pressure you're going to apply, very little change in volume, very little expansion. So fibrosis is reduced compliance, right? So this is what they can ask you. What they are showing you in this graph is known as hysteresis. So delta V by delta P of the inspiration is different from the expiration. So this is what they ask you, that what is this known as, and what is responsible for it is actually the surfactant, alright? So surfactants are responsible for this difference in the transpulmonary pressure in inspiration and expiration. That's what you wanna know. Few patterns that can be asked to be recognized. So this is normal breathing, inspiration and expiration. When you see that there are, first of all, you look at the third graph. When you see that there is very high amplitude, deep breathing, this is what we know as the Kussmaul's breathing. So this is Kussmaul's breathing, deep and rapid breathing. And where do we see this? We see this in metabolic acidosis. This I have taught you in the renal, yeah. So metabolic acidosis, what you're gonna have is the body trying to lose out acid, lose out CO2. So there's hyperventilation. So this is Kussmaul's breathing. On the other hand, when you have hyperpnea and then you have apnea in between, two things you need to distinguish. One is Biot's breathing and one is Kind-Stokes breathing. So remember, when it is a crescendo like this, C for crescendo, C for Kind-Stokes. So this is Kind-Stokes breathing that you have in C for CVS, cardiovascular causes. Alright, so in cardiovascular causes like MI, you can have Kind-Stokes breathing where you see a crescendo and then there is apnea. If you have sudden apnea from hyperpnea, this is known as Biot's breathing. And B for brain. So you want to remember this is seen in CNS insults like brain death. Alright, so this is about the different respiratory patterns. Now let's talk about the respiratory regulation. So here it's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. So we have the cerebrum here which is regulating the voluntary respiration. The only thing wherein the body controls it on its own also, and when you want to take over, the body allows you, that fine. You can take deep breaths. If you're doing yoga or something, you can have voluntary control as well. So this is the cerebrum responsible for voluntary breathing. Pons is the main center where you have two centers. One is the pneumotactic center and one is the apneustic center. So you want to remember the PNC is going to determine the rate of breathing and apneustic center is going to determine the depth, how deep is your breath. Okay, so PNC and APC. What you want to remember is that PNC inhibits the APC and you have the 10th cranial nerve which inhibits the APC. So you want to remember P10. You know the P10 gene for Cowden syndrome that we've studied in GI. So you want to remember PNC and 10. Both of them are inhibiting APC. APC also happens to be a gene, right? So this is how you can remember APC, P10, and both of them are actually mutated in CA colon. We have studied this in adenoma carcinoma sequence. So this is how we have a mnemonic here of other stuff that you can remember with it. So we have P10. So now when any of them is affected, you're going to have increased depth. Yeah. So when apneustic center basically is inhibited, you're going to have higher depth of breathing. If both of them are gone, both of them are cut, the body is going to go into a state of inspiratory spasm known as apneusis. Okay, so this is about that, and then you have the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, you have DRG, VRG, which are basically your inspiratory and expiratory centers. Not very important. What is one-liner is there is a pre-Butzinger complex, which is known as the pacemaker. All right, which is known as the pacemaker for breathing. Now the kind of questions that you're going to get from here are going to be about transaction. That if I have a transaction at this level, what's going to happen? Alright, so that's what we're going to fill in this table. It's pretty simple. Okay, so now let's say I have a transaction above pons, meaning whatever is on the top of the lesion, that function is going to be lost. That's the concept you want to remember. So when the lesion is above the pons, it means that the cerebral control is gone. So when the vagus is intact, there's no issue. There's just the voluntary control of respiration which is lost. Yeah, it makes sense. On the other hand, if you cut the vagus nerve, what's going to happen? One of the inhibitors of the depth is gone. So can I say that the depth of breathing increases? Yeah. On the other hand, if I have a section at mid-pons, meaning now PNC is lost. So again, if vagus is intact, just the depth will increase. But if vagus is also cut, means both P10 are gone, PNC is gone, 10 is gone. So now we are going to be in a state of apneusis. So let's have a look at it on a diagrammatic representation. So the lesion A is when you are above the pons. So this is normal, just the voluntary control is lost. Here you can see how the depth of the breathing has increased. Same when you have a mid-pons lesion, vagus is intact, so you're going to have deep breathing. But look at this, when P10 is gone, that is when you have apneusis. Yeah, so this is how you can actually correlate. On the other hand, if you have a lesion between pons and medulla, both the regulators of rate and depth are gone, right? So it doesn't matter whether vagus is intact or not, your APC is gone, so you're going to have irregular breathing in both of these, like you can see. And below the medulla, do you have any centers left? No centers are left. So now below the medulla, the breathing ceases. Alright, so this is what you wanna remember about the lesions. Usually it is this level which is asked. So if you remember P10, you are sorted. Now what is this girl doing here? So this girl is gonna explain us what is Ondine's curse. Ondine's curse is the medico version of Raton ki Neend Churana. So what is that? So basically Ondine, so this is a mythological story in which Ondine gave a curse to his lover who was probably cheating on her. The curse was that this person cannot have any spontaneous breathing, but he does have voluntary breathing. So this means that voluntary breathing is intact, but the medullary centers are not working. So if you have, say, a medullary lesion, encephalitis tumor, whenever there is a medullary lesion, you're not gonna have spontaneous breathing. None of these centers are working, but voluntary breathing is intact. So what does this mean? Can this person ever sleep and just be carefree that the body is gonna take care of it? No, right? So this person cannot sleep. So this is Ondine's curse. Alright, so this is what you want to remember, also known as central apnea. So this is also known as central hypoventilation syndrome. Okay, so this is what you can remember. Alright, this is the Ondine's curse. With this hypoventilation syndrome, now let's talk about sleep apnea. So in sleep apnea, what they can ask you is about obstructive sleep apnea and central sleep apnea. The point in both of these is that it's only during sleep that hypoxia occurs. PO2 is normal during the day. Alright, so it's only gonna be during the sleep. So once I see that PO2 is normal during the day, it is either obstructive sleep apnea, in which you're gonna have symptoms like snoring, daytime sleepiness, right? Obstructive sleep apnea, or it's central, wherein you are not getting signals from the brain. So this is central sleep apnea. Now, how do you distinguish it is on the basis of polysomnography. So this is the investigation of choice. So this is what they can actually give you in the exam, this polysomnography graph, and you'll have to interpret it. So what you're seeing is when there is apnea, when the airflow is zero, are the abdominal muscles moving? Yes. So the respiratory effort is there. So this is how you can actually know that the respiratory muscles are moving. This means that there is obstruction at the level of the mouth which is happening. So this is how you can diagnose obstructive sleep apnea. But when the signal is only not coming, when you see that there is stasis, the abdominal muscles are also not moving, that's how you can identify central sleep apnea. Alright, so this is the distinguishing factor between the two. Here, the thoraco-abdominal muscles are not gonna be working. Okay, now in the other form, wherein they would describe that the patient has obesity, morbid obesity with hypoventilation, in which during the day as well you are having PaCO2 retention. So there's affection during the day and you have CO2 retention, which is the main problem. So the name itself tells you everything. This is known as obesity hypoventilation syndrome. So obviously they're not going to tell you patient is obese and is hypoventilating. The other name is going to be Pickwickian syndrome. So this is what could be a potential INI-CT question. This is obesity hypoventilation or Pickwickian syndrome. Going ahead to pleural effusion, very, very important. First of all, investigation of choice, or the most sensitive investigation that you want to remember for any fluid. We know it from the thumb rules, it's ultrasound, right? Now we want to know about Light's criteria. So Light's criteria was predominantly for exudates, that anytime the ratio of protein in pleura to serum is more than 0.5, or ratio of LDH is 0.6, or it is 2/3 in the pleura for the serum. So this is what is exudate, right? So 0.5, 0.6. So two things, protein and LDH is what we look at. If it's lesser, it is transudative. I'm sure you know about this. So transudative is anytime you have low protein and low LDH. So tell me a few causes. One, we can have hepatic cirrhosis, that is known as hepatic hydrothorax. The most common cause is CHF, congestive heart failure, that will lead to transudative. Or you could have nephrotic syndrome where the serum albumin is low. On the other hand, exudative is either malignancy or infection. So infection like pneumonia, parapneumonic effusion or tuberculosis, or you could have malignancy. In fact, pulmonary embolism can also lead to exudative effusion. So this is easy stuff. The specific questions could be about low glucose. So where do you have low glucose? You want to remember REM. REM sleep, we have low glucose. We're not eating during REM sleep, right? So you have hypoglycemia. So that's what you want to remember. One very important cause is rheumatoid arthritis. E is going to be empyema. Again, very, very important. Low glucose values, and M is malignancy. Malignancy is always going to figure everywhere. On the other hand, high amylase. So either there is pancreatitis which is leading to the effusion, or there is esophageal perforation, so any of the GI conditions, and when in doubt, malignancy. Yeah, so 3 causes of high amylase as well. Now, what are the indications of draining an effusion? Should all exudative or transudative effusions be drained? Definitely not. So remember, anytime there is infection of, secondary infection of the fluid, which is known as empyema, is when you want to drain it. So one radiological sign that I'm showing you here is on the CT, you'll see the pleura getting thickened, and that is showing enhancement. This is known as the split pleura sign. So one is empyema, radiological evidence of empyema, or you are seeing on ultrasound that there is a loculated, a collected effusion. It's not showing you that meniscus sign that we see on effusion, right? So loculated effusion or the presence of adhesions within the effusion is what you're going to be seeing. Apart from that, on the tap, if you find that pH is less than 7.2, or you find that there is low glucose, because we saw that that's a sign of empyema, or you could do a positive gram stain or culture, which means that there are bacteria within the effusion. It's not a reactive effusion, it is an infected effusion. So these are all of the indications when you need to drain it. And how do you drain it? You put in an ultrasound guided pigtail. We've seen the pigtail in surgery. Yeah, so this is the pigtail. Something very important for AIIMS particularly is this. When they show you this milky fluid coming out from the tap, what is this? This is chylothorax. It frequently occurs as lymphatic leaks. So the definition of chylothorax is when you have more than 100 mg per dl triglyceride in the fluid, that is defined as chylothorax. You also want to remember what is one cause of pseudochylothorax, where the fluid is milky but the triglyceride levels are low. That is rheumatoid arthritis again, because there you have cholesterol crystals. So this is INI-CT potential question, all right. So this is about pleural effusion. So now let's talk about respiratory failure. Very, very important. So type 1 is when you have hypoxia which is predominant. So here what you're going to find is that the PaO2 is low but the PaCO2 is normal. So where do you find hypoxemic respiratory failure? So either of these, blood gas exchange goes wrong. So either the alveoli is not filled with air, it is filled with something else, which is known as consolidation, or you have a problem with the alveolar thickening such as ILD, or you have a problem with the blood such as a pulmonary embolism. So any of these compartments going wrong is hypoxemic. So there could be consolidation. Now consolidation could be seen in pneumonia. Yeah, it could be seen in pulmonary edema, which could be cardiogenic, or ARDS. Or you could have interstitial lung disease where you have this thickening of the alveoli because of fibrosis, or pulmonary embolism. So all of these conceptually you can remember, no need to memorize the list, is hypoxemic respiratory failure. What is hypercapnic respiratory failure is where you have CO2 retention, as the name suggests. So this is hypoventilation. You do have hypoxia, but what is the hallmark is PaCO2 increasing. Alright, so this is known as hypoventilation type of respiratory failure. So here the causes you want to remember as, first could be central. From the brain itself, you are not having the respiratory drive. Respiratory drive is absent either because of intracranial hemorrhage or any other lesion. Second could be obstruction. When you have severe obstruction like say COPD, then you can have peripheral causes here. So peripheral causes like neuromuscular chest wall diseases, right? So neuromuscular chest wall diseases, like we saw with DLCO being normal and a restrictive presentation such as kyphoscoliosis, myasthenia gravis, or there could be diaphragm injury which is leading to hypoventilation. All right, so you can remember this by COPD. Okay, so this is COPD, 4 causes of type 2 respiratory failure. Type 3 respiratory failure is perioperative. So here they're going to give you a direct history that what is the respiratory failure that occurs around the time of the surgery, and this is frequently because of lung atelectasis. We have also talked about this in post-op fever causes. Yeah, so this is due to atelectasis, and one of the methods by which we can prevent it is by good chest physiotherapy and by using incentive spirometer. I've also showed you that incentive spirometer can reduce type 3 respiratory failure. Type 4 very specific because of shock with hypoperfusion to the chest wall muscles, you are having respiratory failure. So both of these you just want to remember the names. All right, so this is about respiratory failure. While we talk about ARDS, you want to remember that this is non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. So here you're going to have alveolar filling with inflammation. So it starts off with edema and hyaline membranes, that is the exudative stage. Slowly, you're going to have inflammation and eventually there is fibrosis. So this is the timeline, is from Harrison. So within the first 7 days, exudative phase, 7 to 21 days is going to be proliferative, and then fibrosis sets in around 3 weeks. Okay. So this is about the timeline. What is the diagnostic criteria? So this is the modified Berlin's criteria that you need to know. This is very, very frequently tested. So one is about the oxygenation severity. So which about you. So first is about the hypoxia. So here what you look at is a ratio of PaO2 by FiO2. Alright, so this is the ratio that we want to look at. In mild disease, it is going to be between 200 to 300. In moderate, it is 100 to 200, and in severe, it is less than 300. Okay, so this is about PaO2 by FiO2 that you want to look at. Then the onset. So this has to be within 1 week of any history that is associated. So there could be pancreatitis, there could be trauma, there could be some toxins or sepsis. So within 1 week, the onset should happen. Radiographs should show bilateral opacities which are consistent with pulmonary edema but does not have effusion, collapse or nodules. So basically, if I talk about the X-ray, this is how we can distinguish cardiogenic from non-cardiogenic, and that's also one of the criteria that there is absence of left atrial hypertension. So you basically want to rule out that there is no cardiogenic pulmonary edema. So this is basically defined as normal pulmonary capillary wedge pressure between 8 to 12 mm. So this is what must be present. So just to show you these two X-rays, when you see that there are peripheral based opacities, there are multifocal opacities, not central, there is no effusion or any interstitial thickening, this is ARDS for you. Look at the patchy alveolar opacities. So this is what we see with COVID as well, right? So this is ARDS for you. On the other hand, if you see this typical bat wing sign wherein you have this central perihilar opacities, it can also be associated with cardiomegaly. It can be associated with pleural effusion. There could be curly lines which are interstitial edema. So frequently you see the curly B horizontal lines at the base, or you can see at the hilum. These are findings of cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Alright, so this tells you the radiology of ARDS versus cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Very, very important, the parameters for the ventilation of ARDS. So you just want to remember two things, that you give a low tidal volume less than or equal to 6 ml per kg, and you give a positive PEEP, the plateau pressure is less than 30. Just remember these two, respiratory rate is less than 35. So this is volume pressure limited ventilation. Oxygenation criteria, so this is again from Harrison's, FiO2 ideally less than 60%, and the target SpO2 is 88 to 95. Minimize acidosis and diuresis if the MAP is more than 65. Alright, so this is about the ARDS management. Now let's talk about pulmonary embolism. So here frequently they'll give you some sort of history of DVT, such as patient being on OCPs or patient having a long haul flight where you have been immobilized for a long time, or a fracture. So one of the three parts of the Virchow's triad is going to be given to you. What was the Virchow's triad in pathology that we've studied? One is there could be stasis, so there could be some sort of immobilization that could be mentioned. Second is endothelial injury, so maybe some sort of catheterization which can lead to thromboembolism. Or third could be hypercoagulable state, so either congenital hypercoagulable state, or maybe the patient is on OCPs or other hypercoagulable states. Alright, so this is about the history, and after that they'll tell you that there is unilateral limb which is swollen, which is red, and the patient now has acute dyspnea. What is the likely diagnosis? We think of pulmonary embolism. So in the exam, they can either ask you to calculate the score. Otherwise, if they are just mentioning this and they're asking you what will you do next, no need to calculate this, because what you see here is that alternative diagnosis less likely than PE gives you 3 points. So if clinically you feel that PE is what is likely based on the history, your likelihood more or less is going to exceed 4. Alright, so this is what is known as the Wells score, or the modified Wells score basically, for the likelihood of pulmonary embolism. So if DVT signs are present and likely is PE, you are already there with a score of 6. If there is tachycardia or immobilization more than 3 days, or surgery within 4 weeks, prior history, hemopsis, cancer. So in one old exam, you were asked to calculate the score based on the parameters. So you just want to put this in choti copy and look at it once for INICT. Otherwise, clinically for the diagnostic algorithm, it won't be needed, in the actual exam. So what is the diagnostic algorithm is that you calculate the Wells score. If the clinical possibility is less than 4, meaning there is low probability, you go for the most sensitive test, that is D-dimer. So you do the most sensitive test, which is D-dimer. If this comes out to be normal or negative, you can actually rule out pulmonary embolism. But if this comes out to be positive, or you have high suspicion, which is your score is more than 4, then what you go for is a CTPA. This is the investigation of choice for pulmonary embolism. This is CT pulmonary angiography, wherein I inject contrast, and you're going to be seeing these filling defects here in both the pulmonary arteries. So this is bilateral pulmonary embolism. So this is the diagnostic approach. In addition, you want to remember other things. So if we talk about the echocardiography, we can actually look at the RV dyskinesis or RV strain with the help of something known as the McConnell sign. So in McConnell sign, what you're going to see is that the right free wall is tired. It is akinetic, but the apical wall is not giving up. It is like, I am going to pump. So this is hyperkinetic, but RV free wall is akinetic. So that is known as the McConnell sign, which is a sign of right ventricular strain. Another sign of RV strain is the ECG, the most specific ECG pattern that I'm sure you know, which is S1Q3T3. So you see the S1Q3T3 wave. This is the most specific, which indicates RV strain, but you also want to remember most common is nothing but sinus tachycardia here. Just like that, on X-rays, you do have named signs like Westermarck sign, Hampton's hump, but again, the most common thing that you see is the X-ray either being normal, or if they ask you the most common abnormality, it's actually pleural effusion. Okay, so this is about the pulmonary embolism. Now, treatment algorithm will depend on whether the patient is stable or unstable. If the patient is stable, you just have to prevent the next embolism from happening. The body is going to take care of this one. You just have to start the patient on anticoagulation. On the other hand, if the patient is unstable or there are signs of RV strain, in that case, what you want to do is you start the patient on anticoagulation plus thrombolytics. So you have to give thrombolytics to the patient. Now here the good question, INI-CT question could be, what if anticoagulation is contraindicated? In that case, in a stable patient, all you got to do is prevent another one from happening. You put in an IVC filter. This is what it looks like. You can be given an image-based question, right? So this IVC filter, if you've seen those head massagers, yeah, which are very irritating and give you that funny sensation, this is what it kind of looks like, a very tiny version of it. This we put in the infrarenal IVC, all right? So below the renal vein is where we place this. And if the patient is unstable and this is contraindicated, you have to do either a surgical or an endovascular embolectomy. You got to remove that embolus. Okay, so this in a nutshell in one slide is all the possible questions from PE, pulmonary embolism. From there, going on to pulmonary arterial hypertension. So here you have the Dana point classification that you want to remember. So there are 5 types. You should know all the details. Type 1 is where you've ruled out everything, idiopathic or hereditary. The gene is also important for INI-CT particularly. This is BMPR2 gene that you want to know. Bone morphogenetic protein is what you can remember. It can also be associated with connective tissue, HIV. So one infection, HIV, another is schistosomiasis. Two infections leading to PH. When we talk about connective tissue, if you remember, CREST has the highest association with PH, right? Portal hypertension, congenital heart disease or hemolytic anemia. So these are all primary. Second group is when you have pulmonary arterial hypertension secondary to the left heart disease. Third is where you have lung disease or hypoxia that is leading to PH. Fourth is your last thing that we did, chronic thromboembolism leading to PH. And fifth is unclear. So fifth, nobody will ask you. So you want to remember, chronic thromboembolism is going to be type 4. 3 is going to be lung disease or hypoxia. 2 is left heart. Alright, so this is about the PH classification. The X-ray findings is going to be the fact that the pulmonary arteries, the lung hilum is very much dominant and then there is sudden peripheral pruning. You see that the hilum is dominant and then you see this pruning here. So this is what is known as the jug handle sign. The pulmonary artery looks like a handle. This is the X-ray sign. Histopathologically, this is what you see. This is known as plexiform arteriopathy. This could be tested. This is predominantly noted in the first type. Okay. Now, how do you approach PH? This is the recent advance, particularly for students appearing for INI-CT. You should see this. So, what we are going to do is, first off, everybody gets the general management, that is diuretics, oxygen, anticoagulation and digoxin. So, you can remember DOAD is your first line management. After that, you do a acute vasoreactivity testing. In this, if you find that it is positive, then you start the patient on oral calcium channel blockers. All right. What is acute vasoreactivity testing is if you give the patient inhaled nitric oxide or other vasodilators, if the pulmonary arterial pressure falls by 10 mm or greater, yeah, that is what is known as a positive pH, means that you are responding to the vasodilators. These are candidates for CCBs and you can just maintain these patients up with oral calcium channel blockers. If this test is negative, you look at the risk depending on the symptoms. Lower risk patients can be started on ERA. ERA, very important from pharma point of view, the names, endothelin receptor antagonist, you have bosentan and the other sentans, okay. The next line is going to be PDE5 inhibitors, which are oral, so sildenafil or tazalafil, I'm sure you know that. If the patient does not respond, then you can start on prostacyclins such as treprostinil or iloprost. So this is prostacyclin. So remember the step up here. First line, if they are responding, it's calcium channel. Otherwise, it's endothelin receptor antagonist followed by PDE5 inhibitors and then you give prostacyclins. On the other hand, if the patient is at higher risk, then you want to start with prostacyclins and you could also consider other drugs, okay. Apart from that, high risk patients can also be taken for surgeries. So this, I don't think they're going to reach till here. Either it's going to be this or this that they can ask you. Also have a drug known as riociguat, which is a guanylate cyclase stimulator that you can try. So just go through these names once. So now we talk about chest infections. So here radiology plays a very important role. So what you are seeing in the first image is complete opacification of the right upper lobe, yes, and look at the position of the horizontal fissure. So when the horizontal fissure is horizontal, this is how we recognize that it's a consolidation. If this is going up, it means there is volume loss. So this is the difference between collapse and consolidation. Both of them will have an opaque lobe. When it is going up, it means it is collapse. If it is horizontal, this is consolidation. Alright, what has been asked previously is this HRCT image. So this is the exact image that has been asked, and they've asked what is this sign. So whenever in consolidation you have alveoli which are opaque and the airway which is black, which is patent, you're going to have this sign that is known as air bronchogram sign. Okay, so this is the air bronchogram sign wherein the bronchus remains black and the alveoli is opaque. What you see in this middle X-ray here is this black air containing lesion with surrounding consolidation that is known as a pneumatocele. Okay, so this is what we know as pneumatocele, and this is a hallmark feature of Staph aureus pneumonia. So this tells you Staph aureus, whereas when you see a lobar consolidation, remember always the most common cause of a lobar pneumonia is Streptococcus pneumoniae. Alright, so this is about consolidation pneumatocele. This is again a radiology question that I'm just trying to integrate. They keep asking you this all the time, that which lobe is this in? Is it in the right middle lobe or right lower lobe? So for this we use a sign that is known as the silhouette sign. Yeah, what does the silhouette sign say? That if you see this opacity is merging with heart, or the margin between heart and opacity is not clear, like in this case, we will localize it to the right middle lobe. But if you see the margin is clear, it is in lower lobe. If you're stuck in the exam, you mark middle. That is what is most commonly tested. Alright, so this is the silhouette sign. Now, talking about the medicine part of it. So we have Curb 65 scoring. You are now getting a lot of questions based on this. So what is Curb 65? So remember, confusion 1 point, urea more than 19 or 7 millimoles, RR respiratory rate more than 30, systolic BP less than 90 or diastolic less than 60, and age more than 65 years. So this is again something that goes to choti copy. I'm sure you'll remember the parameters here, Curb 65, but even the values I feel become very important. So you want to remember 7, 30, 60, 90. Actually 30, 60, 90 is easy to remember. Yeah, 65 the score itself is telling. So effectively more than 19 mg per dl urea or more than 7 millimoles is what you gotta remember. If there is score of 0 to 1, you can manage the patient with outpatient antibiotics. Drug of choice is amoxicillin. You may or may not add macrolides or doxy. If the score is 2, you want to admit, consider inpatient. So the first line becomes fluoroquinolone or beta-lactams plus azithral or doxy. And if the patient is having 3 to 5, beta-lactams plus fluoroquinolone / azithral. Alright, so basically you want to remember that fluoroquinolones and beta-lactams become more preferred later on. Otherwise, it's just amox, which is the first line drug. Okay, so this repeat question has come. So this is chest infections. Now let's talk about aspergillus infection. So there are 3 types of infections that you want to remember. First is ABPA. As the name suggests, this is not a infection. This is actually a hypersensitivity reaction. So allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis. So this is actually a type 1 hypersensitivity. Now people also say it is 3 or 4. So basically it's not 2. Apart from that, it could be anything, predominantly type 1, because what you're going to see, this is the Rosenberg criteria. Again, very, very important. So in Rosenberg criteria, what you're going to be seeing is there is eosinophilia, skin test or precipitin test is positive, IgE is raised. So these are all markers of type 1. You can have episodic bronchial obstruction or bronchiectasis with transient infiltrates. You can have flex in sputum or late skin test. So not very important to be memorized. Just remember grossly what are the features. Radiologically, you're going to see bronchiectasis with this mucus filling in, which gives rise to this finger in glove appearance. Because it's predominantly a hypersensitivity, the treatment is going to be steroids plus itraconazole here. Alright, so steroids are what are very important. On the other hand, the second one, where you have a pre-existing cavity and the fungus aspergillus is like, please let me stay there rent free, and the body is like, all right, you can come and live with me. So the cavity houses the fungal ball, right? So this is fungal ball, which is also known as aspergilloma. So what you're going to be seeing in fungal ball or aspergilloma is a cavity with this fungal ball, and you see this black crescent of air that is known as the monad sign. Some people also call it monod, so don't be stressed about that. Okay, so this is fungal ball or aspergilloma. Do you want to give any antifungals here? No, the fungus is just living in a very peaceful saprophytic reaction. Alright, so there's no need to give any antifungals. If the patient has any symptoms, you just give symptomatic treatment. If it is refractory, then you can do a lobectomy here. Okay. On the other hand, the worst type of aspergillus is when it affects the immunocompromised. So when you see immunocompromised patients with multiple such nodules and you see center is white and periphery is ground glass, this is known as halo sign. So halo sign, center is going to be solid and the periphery shows you this ground glass opacity. Alright, so this is a sign of invasive aspergillosis. This is what the patients of neutropenia frequently present with. So they can give you a description of febrile neutropenia or give you a history of an immunocompromised patient. Drug of choice here is going to be voriconazole. Alright, so the drug of choice is going to be voriconazole. Alright. In fact, even in ABPA, my bad, the treatment is also here going to be steroids plus voriconazole. Alright, itraconazole is something that is going to be used for endemic mycosis. So vowels stick together. Zainab should have remembered that. So this is what you want to remember. Alright, so steroids plus voriconazole. On the other hand, if you see this reverse halo sign, alright, so this is the reverse halo sign in which you see that the periphery is solid, the center is showing this hazy ground glass opacity. This is what is a feature of mucormycosis. Okay, so this is mucormycosis, reverse halo. This is also known as a bird's nest. It kind of does look like that. So this is a bird's nest sign. This is mucormycosis is what you want to remember. Also remember here that the reverse halo sign typically has been described for organizing pneumonia, OP or organizing pneumonia, but since we're talking about infections, you would be given an immunocompromised patient or a diabetic patient. You want to consider mucor here. Okay, so this is about the other fungal infections. Now going on to asthma. So you know asthma is reactive airway disease. The pharmacology becomes very important according to the GINA 2021 update. You want to know about the controller and the reliever. So the controller is the drug which basically reduces the inflammation here. So that is inhaled corticosteroid, whereas the reliever, previously we would only use bronchodilators, but now the thinking is you got to do bronchoprotection as well as reduced inflammation. So now the reliever of choice according to the GINA update is you give formoterol in addition to inhaled corticosteroid. Alright, so you want to remember this. This is potential INI-CT question, reliever and controller. So now let's see what are all the drugs and where they act in asthma. Very important from pharma point of view. Okay, so first is, let's just do it with path. So anytime you have any exposure to allergen, you're going to have a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction, which is the degranulation of mast cells, which is going to result in inflammation, right? So you can actually use anti-IgE monoclonal antibodies, that is omalizumab. Very, very important first drug, omalizumab anti-IgE. Or other monoclonal antibodies, you can have Mepoli or Reslizumab or Benralizumab. Just see this once. So IL-5, which is going to activate the eosinophils, either you bind that or Benralizumab is going to be the receptor. Alright, so Benra is the receptor, whereas the other two, Mepoli and Resli, are your IL-5 inhibitors. So these are the monoclonal antibodies for asthma. Recent updates you want to remember. Then cromolyn is what prevents the degranulation of mast cells. So, but this I can't use it in an active attack. Degranulation has already happened. So that's why all of these drugs are basically for prophylaxis of very severe asthma is where they come into picture. Once asthma attack has happened, now I want to deal with inflammation and I want to cause bronchodilation, isn't it? So how do we reduce inflammation? Just as we discussed, inhaled corticosteroids are the first line. So we want to block the inflammatory cascade. So we use glucocorticoids like fluticasone or budesonide, which block the synthesis of the prostaglandins. Apart from that, because leukotrienes play a very important role in the inflammatory cascades here, you can use anti-leukotrienes or antagonists to the receptors. So we have montelukast and zafirlukast, which are your anti-receptors, whereas you can block the LOX enzyme 5-lipoxygenase, which is xylitol. Okay, these are very useful for exercise or aspirin-induced asthma. All right, so this is what you want to remember here. On the other hand, the main function, which is to cause bronchodilation. So for this, we can either block acetylcholine, which is going to cause bronchoconstriction. So we have muscarinic antagonist, which is tiotropium, ipratropium. Or you could basically use the B2 agonist, which further cause bronchodilation. So either you block acetylcholine or you favor the beta 2 agonist. So here we can use salbutamol, terbutaline, salmeterol and formoterol. So here you want to remember the first two are short acting beta agonists, whereas salmeterol and formoterol are long acting beta agonists. Further in the LABAs, what you want to remember, this has a slow onset of action, whereas formoterol, F for fast onset, and that is why this is now becoming the first line reliever, because this has dual action. It's starting fast and it has a long acting ability. All right, so formoterol is what is fast. All right. The questions invariably come from theophylline all the time. So theophylline, remember, has two actions here. One, it is blocking the adenosine, which is causing bronchoconstriction. Second, it is blocking the phosphodiesterase as well, which is going to break down the CAMP that is causing bronchodilation. So two actions, phosphodiesterase inhibitor and adenosine. So this is very important, and apart from that, there is a third action, which is histone deacetylase. So very potential INI-CT question. Theophylline acts by all of these mechanisms, except whenever you have three things coming in, always, you know, a bell should ring. This is a potential question. Okay, so what all? Adenosine, PDE and histone deacetylase activation. If you remember from biochemistry, histone acetylation activates, whereas deacetylation deactivates. So this basically suppresses the expression of DNA. Okay, so this is basically the mechanisms of theophylline, but now that it has so many mechanisms, it must be very effective. It is, but it has a very narrow therapeutic index. So it's cardiotoxic, neurotoxic. It's also metabolized by CYP, so it has a lot of interactions. So that's how usually theophylline is asked, either mechanism or interactions. So this in a nutshell takes care of our pharma of asthma. Very quickly, few updates. So this is Gold 2023, this year update here, wherein we have stopped using ABCD. I'm sure most of you have learned ABCD. It's gone. It's now ABE. So world is simpler for us. They have not changed the gold grading. So that is still the same, wherein we are doing the percentage FeV1 here. So here the number is 30, 50 and 80. 30 plus 50 equals 80. So that's what you remember here, this formula. So less than 30, gold 4. 30 to 50, gold 3. 50 to 80, more than 80. Yeah. So if you remember this, categorization is sorted. Then how do you classify the three groups? So here A, B and E categorization now. So A and B is on the basis of two things. So if MMRC is 0 to 1 and CAT score, which is COPD assessment test, it is a sort of a questionnaire. If that is low, means the patient is low risk, it is A. If MMRC is more than equal to 2 and the CAT is more than equal to 10, it is B. So I hope you remember the MMRC grading. Alright, so here just to revise, remember MMRC grade 0 is what you and I could have, or basically I actually do have, is when you do a strenuous exercise, you're gonna have dyspnea. One is when you're walking up a hill and then you have dyspnea. 2 means two friends, so peers. When you're walking with your peer and you start to have breathlessness when he doesn't, is grade 2. 3 is on walking for around 100 meters. Okay, you start to have dyspnea. And 4 is when you can't do daily chores. The moment you leave the house or you are dressing, undressing, that causes dyspnea. That is 4. So how to remember this is, you're planning a trip with your friend. So you got to dress. If you can't do that, You are 4. If you started but 100 meters, you started to have dyspnea, you couldn't go on the trip, that's 3. You met your friend but you started having dyspnea, that's 2. You did go on that trip to the hill and then you had dyspnea. 0 is after climbing on the hill you had dyspnea. So this is how you can remember the grading. Coming back, so A and B are sorted. E is when you have E for exacerbation. So when you have either more than equal to 2 exacerbations or any one that leads to hospitalization, you are category E. Management. So A is just SABA or SAMA. So what is this? Short-acting beta agonist or short-acting anticholinergic. For B, you want to give LABA or LAMA, right? So formoterol comes in here. For E, what you want to give is a LABA in addition to LAMA, and you can also add inhaled corticosteroids if you find that there is a component of eosinophilia. If eosinophilia is more than 300, you can start inhaled corticosteroids. Alright, so this is your gold criteria 2023. Now let's talk about the RAD path of COPD. So we want to talk about emphysema and we want to talk about chronic bronchitis. Before I tell you the difference between the two, which I'm sure you already know, on X-ray, what you're going to have is hyperventilation. So the surest sign of hyperventilation is this flattening of diaphragm. Alright. So when you see that there is flattening of diaphragm, so this is the surest sign of air trapping or hyperinflation. Alright, so this is what you're going to be seeing in COPD. This is hyperinflation. Okay. Now in emphysema, we have 3 types. So when you see that the acinus is what is enlarged, this is the centri-acinar type or the centri-lobular type. When you see that the complete lobule, not just the center, is enlarged, this is the pan-acinar type. The radiologist is going to use a term pan-lobular, same thing, centrilobular, pan-lobular. And when you see peripheral bullae like this is what is known as the paraseptal type. Alright, so these are the 3 types of emphysema. Remember, centri-acinar is more common in the upper lobes, it is more common in smokers. On the other hand, very important question, pan-acinar is more common in the lower lobes. In fact, on the CT, you can see how trachea is bifurcated. We are in the lower lobes, whereas here you see the trachea, we are in the upper lobes. This is associated with alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. The moment you hear cirrhosis and emphysema, the one thing is alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So paraseptal type is where you're going to be seeing that there are peripheral bullae, and this is what frequently ruptures. So when you are given a history of a thin, tall male, right, who is frequently a smoker, he would have these bullae which can rupture, leading to primary spontaneous pneumothorax. Okay, so this is the paraseptal emphysema. Then talking about chronic bronchitis, what I want you to remember is this path finding, which is known as Reed's index. So Reed's index is increased. There is more than 0.4 Reed index, which is the ratio of the amount of mucous glands, the thickening of mucous glands to the basement membrane to cartilage. So the wall thickness is the denominator and the glands are the numerator. Alright, so this is the Reed's index. So now I'm sure you know pink puffers and blue bloaters. So patients with emphysema are your pink puffers. They are gonna have no cyanosis here, and they're gonna have an increased epidiameter barrel chest, whereas chronic bronchitis, these are your blue bloaters, they frequently have cyanosis. Okay, so this is about emphysema, chronic bronchitis. Talking about bronchiectasis, which is irreversible dilatation of the bronchi. On the X-ray, you can see so many lines. This is known as tram track. You can see the thickened wall and dilated bronchi. This is what is known as the tram track sign, and what you're seeing on the CT is actually the dilatation of the bronchi with respect to the vessel. So this is the vessel which is very narrow, whereas the bronchus is dilated. This looks like a signet ring. They could also show you a path image, a gross specimen. You can see how the bronchi are thickened and enlarged. Okay, so this is bronchiectasis. What is very important is the localization. So if you find focal bronchiectasis, that is likely because of obstruction. If bilateral upper lobes are given, think in terms of cystic fibrosis. You're going to have severe dilatation here, alright? Cystic fibrosis. If it is unilateral upper lobe, think of TB. Frequently causes fibrosis, bronchiectasis, cavitation in one side, okay? Middle lobes, very important, 2 3-letter words. So one is NTM, non-tubercular mycobacterium. So this is basically known as Lady Windermere syndrome. In the British era, what used to happen is females weren't allowed to cough. So they would suppress the cough and that would lead to colonization of non-tubercular mycobacterium in the middle lobes. Alright, so that's Lady Windermere syndrome, or it could be primary ciliary dyskinesia. If you see that it's associated with situs inversus and sinusitis, you must rule out Cartagener's syndrome. Very important, situs inversus means liver on the left side, spleen on the right side. You would see that this bubble here, stomach bubble, is seen on this side, okay, of the X-ray. If lower lobes are affected, rule out aspiration, rule out immunodeficiency, okay. Most important is proximal, means the trachea and the proximal bronchi are dilated. There are a lot of named syndromes here. So one is Monier-Kuhn syndrome, which is tracheobronchomegaly. Second is William-Campbell syndrome. Again, here you have deficiency of the tracheal cartilage, so the airway enlarges. And the last one is yellow nail syndrome, where you can also have chylothorax, which is associated. Alright, so these are 3 syndromes that you wanna remember. Next, let's quickly talk about ILD. So we know already that this is going to be restrictive lung disease. BLCO is going to be reduced. So there are 2 main types that you want to rule out. Remember, investigation of choice is high resolution CT. So here what you see are these black cysts stacked on one another at the base of the lungs. This is known as honeycombing. So when you see honeycombing, this is the hallmark of usual interstitial pneumonitis. When there is no cause, this is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Histopathologically, the hallmark are 2. One is fibroblastic foci. You are going to see these fibroblasts. And second is temporal heterogeneity. Alright, so you're going to see different time point lesions here. So this is how you have to diagnose UIP. Remember the buzzword honeycombing. Here you have elderly patients who are going to have poor response to steroids. So there's a poor prognosis. 2 drugs which are being tried now. One is pirfenidone and the other one is nintedanib. Both of these drugs are basically going to block the fibrogenic cytokines, alright. So they're going to block the TGF-beta inhibitors, alright. So this is about UIP. Now, if you have another type of ILD where you would be given a middle-aged female with dyspnea, all of these spirometry findings would be given. You see ground glass opacity with subpleural sparing. This pattern is what is known as the non-specific interstitial pneumonitis. Just remember NSIP pattern. This has a relatively good response to steroids and a better prognosis. Okay, so this is UIP, NSIP. Now talking about occupational lung diseases. So all of these fibrosing lung diseases, remember, could either be idiopathic or they could be related to occupation, connective tissue disorder, drugs, radiation. Alright, when they are related to occupational lung diseases, this is one slide which is showing you lots of questions. Alright, again, you study this in PSM, path, medicine, radio, right? So all of it coming together in one page. Remember, when they give you history of mining, so minor or grinder's disease, what you're seeing here is egg shell calcification. Repeat question, alright. So you're seeing the hilar lymph nodes with peripheral calcification. 2 DDs, one is silicosis, second is sarcoidosis. Or you could have these mass-like opacities in bilateral upper lobe. This is a complication of this disease. This is known as PMF, which is progressive massive fibrosis. So what am I talking about? Yes, we're talking about silicosis. So silica exposure, silicosis, remember, upper lobe predominant. All occupational lung diseases are upper lobe except asbestosis. So asbestosis more common in the base, everything else upper lobes, alright. So this is about silicosis. Also remember, silica increases the risk of tuberculosis. Okay, so this is about silicosis. When you see that there is this blackish pigmentation here, this is anthracosis. Okay, so this is anthracosis or coal workers pneumoconiosis. Two syndromes you want to remember. Kaplan's is RA plus coal workers. Erasmus you might not have heard. So this is something extra. This is systemic sclerosis with coal workers pneumoconiosis. Finally, very, very important, they give you the history of electrical insulation, ship repair, base of the lung is involved. This is asbestosis, right? So you can remember as base instead. All right. So the most common finding that you're going to be seeing here is the pleural plaques. So pleural plaques, this is a gross specimen showing pleural plaques, calcified pleural plaques. Histopathologically, you can see these dumbbell bodies here. Okay, so these are dumbbell bodies that you can see. On the X-ray, these pleural plaques are going to show you this holly leaf appearance. So this is known as holly leaf sign of pleural plaques, and one of the most specific malignancies in asbestosis is mesothelioma. So you're going to see this unilateral pleural thickening, and this has something known as frozen hemithorax, meaning there is no mediastinal shift. Usually pleural pathology will push mediastinum contralaterally. Okay, now there are two types, serpentine and amphiboly. You might think that serpentine, snakes are always bad, but here snakes have actually better prognosis than the amphiboly type of asbestos. Alright, so remember one thing, because of asbestosis, the most common malignancy is adeno-CA, whereas the most specific is mesothelioma. So on electron microscopy, how you can distinguish is if you have these short stubby microvilli. This is a feature of short stubby name, adeno-CA. But if you have these long and slender microvilli, long and slender name like mesothelioma. So this is how you can distinguish them pathwise. Apart from that, there are immunohistochemistry marker. So you will see napsin A and TTF1 positivity, whereas cytokeratin would be positive in mesothelioma. Alright, so this is how you distinguish. Remember, ADCA most common, mesothelioma most specific. Okay, just two extra edge ILDs for you. So if they give you history of jewelry or dental alloy industry, granulomatosis is seen. So this is a disease which actually mimics sarcoidosis because it can show granulomatosis. There is a test known as beryllium lymphoproliferative test, and it's associated with DP. This is berylliosis. So you just want to remember berylliosis mimics sarcoid. If history of diamond industry with a giant cell pneumonitis is there, just remember cobalt. So these are just two extra edge things for you from occupational lung diseases. Last topic, we talk about carcinoma lung. So this table is going to summarize all of the manifestations here. So squamous cell, remember, this is the most common Pancoast tumor, wherein you're going to have a chest wall tumor, superior sulcus tumor. This is the only type wherein MRI is better than CT because you want to see nerve invasion, right? We've done that in radio. Small cell CA lung, this is the one which has most common hematogenous metastasis. Okay, this is the most aggressive type. Adeno-CA is the most common type overall in the world, and large cell CA, nothing you want to remember. Okay, so squamous and small cells, so these are both seen in smokers, whereas adeno-CA, remember, is seen in non-smokers. This is more common in females. All right, then location. So again, so squamous and small cell are both centrally located. All right, they are seen in relation to the bronchus, whereas adeno-CA frequently is a peripheral based mass or consolidation. Why am I not saying anything for large cell? Because for all practical purpose, you want to remember large cell is just like small cell. Okay, genes for squamous cell most common is P53. For small cell, you want to remember LMIC. Yeah, so remember CMYC for Burkitt's lymphoma, NMYC for neuroblastoma, LMYC, L for lung, small cell CA. Adeno-CA is going to have EGFR, KRAS mutation and ALK mutation. This is the most important thing for you to remember. Histopath-wise, the hallmark of squamous cell is keratin pearls. So I'm going to show you simultaneously. This is what is known as the keratin pearls here. In small cell, you're going to be seeing a basophilic stippling of the wall. So this basophilic stippling of the wall is what is known as the Azzopardi effect. In addition, you can also see a salt and pepper chromatin. So salt and pepper appearance with this bluish basophilic staining of the vessel wall is known as the Azzopardi effect. In the mucinous type of adeno-CA, you will see how it spreads along the alveolar septae, which is known as the lipidic spread. Okay, so this spreads along the alveolar septae. So this is lipidic spread. Very important is the immunohistochemistry markers. So in squamous cell, you remember P40, P63. In small cell, you want to remember all your neuroendocrine markers. So here you will have synaptophysin, you can have NSE, you can have chromogranin, right? So all of your neuroendocrine markers. In adeno-CA, very, very important, A1 vowels, yeah. So TTF1 and napsin A. Lastly, the paraneoplastic, extremely important. So squamous cell, remember, it causes hypercalcemia of malignancy because it releases parathyroid releasing peptide. Small cell is going to have all endocrine effects. So it can have Cushing's, it can have SIADH, it can have Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome, very, very important. LEMS, it can have Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome. So remember, this is opposite to that of myasthenia gravis. Here, it improves with stimulation, right? So the activity improves with stimulation is LEMS. In adeno-CA, you want to remember Trousseau syndrome, which is migratory thrombophlebitis. Okay. Apart from that, there could also be hypertrophic pulmonary osteoarthropathy, wherein you have swelling of the digits. So I'm going to show you each of these. This is Trousseau syndrome, which is migratory thrombophlebitis in any adeno-CA in the body, not just lung. In pancreas also you can have that. This is the clubbing associated with hypertrophic pulmonary osteoarthropathy. What you are seeing here, very important image-based question is, you can see ptosis, meiosis, enophthalmos. So this is suggestive of Horner syndrome. If there is Horner syndrome, always rule out a superior sulcus tumor, Pancoast, and the most common is squamous cell. On the other hand, if you see something like this where the veins are dilated, there is flushing, they could also show you the Pemberton sign wherein the hands are raised. This is indicative of SVC syndrome. Alright, so this is all about the RAD-path features of CA lung, and with this we conclude respiratory system. I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you.